At 11:40 on the night of April 14th, 1912, the RMS Titanic struck an iceberg that caused the ship to sink less than 3 hours later. Around 2:18 the next morning, the lights went out on the ship. It then broke in two, with the bow disappearing under the water. It took about 6 minutes for that section, traveling at 30 to 40 miles per hour, to reach the ocean floor after about 5 to 10 minutes. And more than 1,500 people, or almost 2/3 of those on board, were dead. We all know some basic facts about the Titanic, but did you know that there are conspiracy theories that claim that the ship never sank and that a mummy's curse was responsible for the disaster? Did you know that several years before the Titanic sank, or was even thought of, 3 works of fiction were published that seemed to predict what happened? Did you know that multiple people, including children, had premonitions that something really bad was going to happen to the Titanic? In 1886, a man named William Thomas Stead, or W.T. Stead, published a short story. In the short story, there's a sailor that's named Thompson, and he's concerned over the amount of lifeboats on the deck. The ship ends up colliding with a small sailing ship because of fog. And as the ship sinks, women and children are given priority seating on the lifeboats, but only 200 survive out of 700. 6 years later, he wrote another short story, and it was called From the Old World to the New, and it's about a ship that's named the Majestic. On board, there's a psychic who senses that another ship has collided with an iceberg. The survivors are rescued, and the Majestic manages to avoid the ice. The captain of the Titanic was also captain of a real ship called Majestic. In 1898, 14 years before Titanic sank, a novella entitled Futility was published. After the Titanic sank, the title was changed to The Wreck of the Titan and was reissued with some changes. The Titan, just like the Titanic, was the largest ship of its time and was unsinkable. And the Titan was 800 feet long, while the Titanic was 882 feet long. Both ships only carried the bare minimum amount of lifeboats, even though there were thousands of passengers on board. Both disasters took place in April, and thousands of people lost their lives. The author, Morgan Robertson, was labeled a psychic after the Titanic sank, but he dismissed it by saying that he was simply knowledgeable about maritime operations, and he just knew what he was talking about. There's a segment on Beyond Belief, Fact or Fiction that talks about this, and I'll put it down below in the description. Captain Smith had a premonition that something bad was going to happen with regards to Titanic. In a collection of letters that were sold in 2016, he mentioned that he was no longer taking command of another ship called the Cymric, and that he'd been placed as captain of the Titanic. But just 2 days before the Titanic hit the iceberg, he wrote in a letter to his sister, "I still don't like this ship. I have a queer feeling about it." He had recently been on the Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic, when it was involved in a collision, but he only had fond feelings for that ship. So you have to wonder why he felt so uneasy about Titanic, and his body was never recovered. W.T. Stead and a young journalist named Shaw Desmond were walking together one day when Stead mentioned that he was going to be sailing on the Titanic. Shaw Desmond had never heard of the Titanic. As they continued to walk, Desmond started to move slightly away from Stead because he was having a very odd feeling. He said that there came to me for the first time in my life the conviction of impending death. He had the overwhelming feeling that Stead would die within the very near future. He felt helpless to stop it, but he didn't think that it had anything to do with Stead's upcoming trip. He decided not to say anything about it, and they eventually went their separate ways. When Desmond arrived home, he made a note about his premonition, and he dated it for future reference. A few days later, he heard the news. The Titanic had gone down in the North Atlantic, and thousands of people were dead. There were rumors early on that W.T. Stead had survived, but Desmond felt certain that those rumors were false. He was correct. Stead died on April 15, 1912, on the Titanic. 24-year-old Alex McKenzie packed his bags and he stood in line to board the Titanic. His parents had given him a ticket as a gift, but a voice in his head warned him that he would die if he stepped onto the ship. The voice was so clear that he looked around to see who was talking, but nobody was there. Thinking that he just misheard it or imagined it, he continued to walk up the gangway when he heard the voice again. He ignored it again, only to hear it one more time, but this time it was louder and stronger. He finally listened, and he went back home to explain to his parents why he changed his mind. There's a legend about a little girl named Jessie that's dying, and it says that on the same night that the Titanic hit the iceberg, a Salvation Army worker was sitting with her. At exactly 11 o'clock that night, Jessie just sprung up in her bed, and she asked the worker to hold her hand because she was scared. She then says, "Can't you see that big ship sinking in the water?" Thinking that her illness was causing her to hallucinate, he tried to comfort her by saying that she had probably just had a bad dream. She said, "No, the ship is sinking. Look at all those people who are drowning. Someone called Wally is playing a fiddle, and he's coming to you." He looked around the room, but he didn't see anything, and he sat with her for several hours, and there was no change in her condition. But suddenly he heard the sound of the latch on the bedroom door. He went to the door and opened it, but nobody was there. He felt the sensation of someone walking by him and into the bedroom. He ran back to Jessie's bed and saw that something had changed, and that death was only moments away. Jessie suddenly opened her eyes and said that her mother had come to take her to heaven, and he held Jessie's hands and she died peacefully. Later, the world would learn what happened. The worker knew Wally Hartley when they were children, but he didn't know anything about him being at sea, and Jessie didn't have any way of knowing that the Titanic would sink that night or who Wally was. He said that the night that he spent with Jessie changed his whole spiritual outlook. And Wally Hartley played his violin as he and his band members went down with the ship. The Titanic Artifact Exhibition in Las Vegas is said to have a ghost that hangs out around the grand staircase. Many employees and some visitors have felt, heard, and witnessed paranormal activity inside the exhibition. Some people have reported a feeling of being followed and they hear footsteps, and others have reported seeing full-bodied apparitions. Many people have said they've heard their name called, followed by playful laughter, and some have had their hair and their clothes pulled. When the exhibit closes for the night, employees have said that they can hear the orchestra playing, and the exhibition houses some of the original items of the Titanic, which could act as a trigger for paranormal activity. Guests and employees are said to see a woman who wears a black period dress with a white collar and her hair is in a bun. But one day, while a photographer was preparing for the opening of the exhibit, he saw the woman just casually walking down the staircase. It spooked him because he didn't see anyone in the room with him, and the staircase was roped off. He assumed that she must have been part of the exhibit, so he asked her if she would like to have her picture taken. She ignored him. When he went back to setting up, he noticed that she was now directly behind him, and he asked her again if she'd like to have her picture taken. But this time she didn't just ignore him. She vanished. Crew members of boats that travel near the site where the collision happened have reported seeing balls of light or orbs, which are balls of light energy which are an indication of a supernatural presence. And submarines that travel near the site have reported hearing strange signals and interference on their radios, including SOS messages that have no variable source. Frederick Fleet served as the lookout, and he spotted the iceberg, but unfortunately, the warning came too late because the ship was going too fast to avoid a collision. He survived the sinking of the Titanic, but after his wife passed away after Christmas in 1964, he was evicted by his brother-in-law and his body was found in the garden. He had taken his own life. People who knew him said that he suffered with survivor's guilt, and some say they see him keeping watch over the Las Vegas exhibition's promenade deck. This photo was taken by the chief steward of a German ocean liner on April the 15th while he was sailing through the North Atlantic a few miles away from where the Titanic had gone down the night before. This photo was taken by the captain of another ship, and he said that this was the only iceberg in the area, and the red paint was a clear sign that a ship had recently struck it. There's some disagreement over whether this was the only iceberg in the area, but it does look like something hit it. According to the conspiracy, the Olympic, the Titanic's older, nearly identical sister ship, was actually the one that went down, and not the Titanic. Some say that the whole disaster was the result of an insurance scam. The Olympic crashed into a warship in 1911, so because of the damage, it had to go to the shipping yard in Belfast for repairs. It was repaired and it sailed to New York and back. It returned to Belfast for more repairs in March 1912. And because of this, the White Star Line wasn't able to receive an insurance payout. So the conspiracy says that they repaired the Olympic as best as they could and claimed that it was the Titanic. This way, the company could collect the insurance money when it sank. If things had gone according to plan, the ship would have gone down slowly and close to another ship so that everyone would be rescued quickly. The thing is that all numbered items pulled from the wreck of the Titanic had the construction number 104 on them, and the Olympic's construction number was 400. So don't take this conspiracy too seriously. This is both an urban legend and a conspiracy, depending on where you're reading it. It says that Titanic carried the cursed mummy of Amun-Ra in its cargo hold, and that it was responsible for the disaster. W.T. Steed, that I mentioned earlier, told the story of the mummy to his dinner companions, but at the time, the mummy was actually being displayed at the British Museum. The next month, the Washington Post ran this headline: Ghost of the Titanic, vengeance of hoodoo mummy followed man who wrote its history. Some people linked the mummy's curse to Egyptian artifacts that Molly Brown had actually taken with her on the Titanic to deliver to a museum in Denver. The wreckage of the Titanic may be completely gone in about 30 years because of a still munching bacteria. It's slowly eating away the iron of the ship's wreck. 125 bodies were buried at sea due either to their severe damage, advanced decomposition, or a lack of embalming fluid. 209 bodies were transported for burial in Halifax, Nova Scotia, with the exception of about 10 bodies that had received serious injuries. Their looks were calm and peaceful. This handwritten account describes how, after a month, one of the bodies was so decomposed that the arm fell off during recovery. In 2004, a photograph was taken of a pair of shoes lying on the ocean floor at the wreckage site. On the 100th anniversary of the Titanic sinking, the photo was released to the public. No human remains have ever been found because bones dissolve relatively quickly at that depth. So the only things left of the passengers who didn't survive are the clothes that they were wearing and their belongings, mainly their shoes. And shoes found closely together more than likely are where a victim's body came to rest.